Hey everyone, it's Badger here, narrating another video for Vadim. Don't you love all the little details you can find in San Andreas, like planes periodically flying overhead? Or maybe you hate this feature because from time to time these planes will crash and blow up, causing havoc all around. For something so unexpected, it ended up becoming pretty famous. Don't you feel extremely lucky when you manage to dodge these crazy planes without getting a scratch? This could give you a heart attack, you know? Legends say if you hear the plane engine noise out of nowhere and it gets louder and louder, then be prepared to be rammed by the plane from the sky. And yes, it usually then explodes. Sound familiar? Of course it does. Did it ever happen while you were trying to complete a mission? Yeah, well, sometimes the game is unfair. You just gotta try again and hope that it won't happen again. Tell me, what could be funnier than watching your favorite speedrunner suffering from it?
Better than his teammate. Holy!
Jokes aside, it's obvious that the speedrunners freaking hate these unexpected accidents during their playthroughs, especially when it just ruined their odds of breaking a record. And these emotions you see on his face are genuine. Sometimes these encounters are so unbelievably insane that you could almost believe that these planes are actually there to hunt you down. It's like they're instilling an anxiety that they're always somewhere nearby, just waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Some players decided to hunt them down. This is how some realize that there's nobody inside flying these planes, leading them to be called ghost planes. All of this led to a lot of myths and debates about whether or not they crash on purpose. What else can you say? These planes do some stupid things, and funny enough, Rockstar was always aware of this too. In 2005, Tips and Tricks magazine had a chance to ask Craig Filshie, the lead level designer, if the plane accidents were intentionally programmed or not, to which Craig said this: "When we first implemented the feature, we found that every once in a while a plane would spawn with a trajectory that led it directly into the side of a mountain, or right into the ground, and we loved it, so it stayed." End of quote. Many years later, Obbe Vermeij, the ex-technical director at Rockstar North, revealed that he was the author of this feature, and he listed the issues with it as he remembered them, adding that he briefly considered removing these encounters altogether because of the aforementioned issues. Fortunately, the flybys stayed in the game, and now we have an interesting story to tell about why these accidents occur, and why this feature was doomed from the day it was implemented. We literally looked at it under a microscope. We hacked the game, visualized every single process these planes are doing, and did a lot of testing by Firehead inventing his own debug tools. We also showed our findings to none other than Obbe himself, and he was really impressed with our work, as he obviously doesn't remember the full picture. I mean, it's been more than 20 years since he worked on this. So yeah, there's a lot to add, and a lot to correct in his statement. But first, we have to understand how this feature even works. The flyby feature can be divided into two plane classes, internally called small planes and big planes. For the small planes, the game randomly chooses between three different models. There's a 50% chance that it'll be a rustler, a 25% chance that it'll be a crop duster, and a 25% chance that it'll be the baegel. As for the big planes, it can either be the AT-400 or the Andromeda, both having an equal chance of being selected. The small planes are coded to appear when the player is located in the two hard-coded weather regions, default and desert, with only one exception to prevent it. The small plane flyby won't occur in the three hard-coded no-plane zones. Think of it as a measure to shrink its spawn region a bit. The big planes are coded to appear when the player is located in the other three hard-coded weather regions, LA, SF, and LV, now with three exceptions to prevent it. The big plane flyby is prohibited from occurring in the same three hard-coded no-plane zones, also in the two hard-coded no-big plane zones, as well as in several gang territories with more than 20 gang densities, which makes their spawn region dynamic because it's something you can affect throughout the game. Generally speaking, the small planes appear around the outskirts, while the big planes appear in the cities. However, due to some oddities, sometimes the small planes appear in the cities too. We'll talk about that problem later. When the plane class is defined, the game goes through the chain of checks to determine if the game is allowed to generate a flyby or not. If you're located in the small plane spawn region, the flyby is set to occur every 2 minutes, but only if all of these conditions you see on your screen are met. If you're located in the big plane spawn region, the flyby is set to occur every 3 minutes and 20 seconds, but only if all these conditions on your screen are met. Both are tied to the same global timer, by the way. But let's talk about the conditions a bit. The most interesting one is that there can't be a sandstorm outside, which is mostly related to Bone County having the weather region desert, which is where the small planes appear. An aircraft will simply not spawn until these weather conditions clear up completely. That's a nice touch from Rockstar, though we're not sure why they didn't do this for fog either. Another interesting condition is that the player must not be inside a plane or a helicopter, which is understandable. It wouldn't be fun colliding with another aircraft while you're just casually flying around. And, you could do some really nasty stuff with the Hydra as well. Maybe Rockstar found it to be a little too controversial to allow that in the early 2000s. You won't see this condition in our debug, because this check is essentially pointless. Later, we'll reveal the reason and why it still works. The flyby also won't occur if you're watching a cutscene, which is kind of a shame. It would have been funny to see these planes doing stupid things in the background. They also won't happen if you're indoors, which makes total sense for it to be. When the plane class is defined and all its conditions are met, the game randomly chooses a plane model from the pool and is set to generate a flyby. To make things easier for us, let's break it down into two separate parts: spawning a plane and navigating a plane. Here's how the spawning algorithm works. Every single flyby generation literally starts with CJ. You don't see it, but he's the center of an invisible circle. Its imaginary circumference is where a plane is eventually going to spawn. If you're located in the small plane spawn region, its radius is 140 meters. If you're in the big plane spawn region, then the radius is a whopping 340 meters. To decide where exactly on the circumference it'll appear, the game randomly chooses an angle and calculates a random height using this simple formula that you can see on your screen. The minimum height for the small plane class is 25 meters, and for the big one it's 200 meters. To make things easier for us, from now on we'll just stick with the small planes, because this is where the differences end. But anyway, the game generated the spawn point in a specific place. After that, the game takes the direction the player is currently looking at and draws an invisible vector to that exact point. Then the game randomly upscales its length and moves its endpoint slightly higher in the sky. By connecting the spawn point with that vector's endpoint, the game gets an invisible line that we colored yellow. This line sets the plane's orientation and the flight direction. After that, this line gets doubled in size and is used to check if the flight direction is actually safe for the plane to fly in by doing this simple check. If this line doesn't hit any obstacle in its way, the spawn point gets approved, so it puts a plane in the direction that it just checked to be safe. However, if this line does penetrate something in its way, the game marks this specific spawn point to be doomed and it gets rejected, so we colored it red. But it doesn't give up yet. The game immediately generates a new spawn point from scratch, adding 10 extra meters to the height in that formula. If it's safe, then it gets immediately approved. Sometimes it goes through the same cycle with randomizations over and over again until it finally generates a safe spawn point somewhere higher to put a plane there. When the spawn point is decided, the spawning algorithm then sets two important parameters for navigation: the flight direction it just checked to be safe, and the safe altitude that the plane has to stick to while flying above any obstacle or terrain that it just generated. This is how the game decides where to spawn a plane. As you can see, the aircraft is coded to appear on a safe flight path above the player in their field of vision. These, in our opinion, are the key features that you should always keep in mind. Now let's talk about the second and more important half: plane navigation. The plane appears in the world always having a sufficient speed and being operated by the plane's artificial intelligence, which manages three main flight parameters: roll, yaw, and pitch. To navigate in space, every other second the AI does the collision check, some sort of terrain scanning which gives instructions on when the aircraft has to turn to avoid an obstacle, and what height it has to maintain in order to stay at a safe altitude. The collision check starts as soon as the AI shoots a beam of 6 invisible medium-range lines from the center point of the plane slightly ahead of it. They are always going to appear in the same order that you see on your screen, and always under the same fixed angles. The most important line in the beam is the first line, which is used to detect a direct hit. If it penetrates an obstacle during the collision check, the AI initiates the flight direction change and the plane gently flies away from an obstacle. The beam can be shot in 19 possible directions, meaning the plane could reroute in 19 possible directions. Each new collision check always starts by shooting the 0-degree beam, and it approves the first beam in the order, whose first line reports that it's safe to fly in its direction. Or in other words, each new collision check finds the best route for the plane for that exact moment, all thanks to the first line in the beam, and only that. Now, there actually is an exception to this formula. We'll get back to that a little bit later. When the beam and its direction are defined, it then shoots the rest of the 5 lines, which initiates the altitude adjustment. By penetrating whatever they come across on their path, the AI roughly understands how tall an obstacle is ahead in that direction. To understand it better, let's pretend that the plane is approaching with something in its way, and a collision check has occurred. Since the 0-degree beam reports no other direct hit, it chooses to fly straight forward, and the rest of the 5 lines of the beam are shot, initiating altitude adjustment in that direction. Lines 4, 5, and 6 penetrated the obstacles. The algorithm looks for the highest penetration point across these 3 lines, which then immediately becomes a new ground level for the route. Since the plane is now below its safe altitude, the AI gives instructions on how to achieve that. So by doing more collision checks, the AI roughly understands how tall the obstacle is, which results in it flying over it on its course. And it does that by constantly shifting the ground level for the route, which is clever. In a nutshell, the collision checks help to plot a safe route by giving indications for the AI as to where the plane has to climb, where it has to descend, and where it has to turn. These indications update every other second. On top of that, the AI is trying to stay at a very low flight level, so the player can always see a plane flying by until it disappears in the distance. This overall gives a good impression of the site, which in our opinion is the key aspect of the small plane class. As for the big plane class, well, these planes just fly very high in the sky and mostly in a straight line. What's worth noting is that they have an increased removal distance, so they don't despawn until they're really far away from the player. More than enough to make a good impression of the site as well, just in a different way. And that's pretty much how the flybys work. Now you must be wondering, why do these planes crash when they're programmed to spawn on a safe path, scan the surroundings, and avoid obstacles in their way? Well, the truth is, it's fundamentally broken in so many ways, which you can obviously tell just by looking at the length of this video. Before we discuss it in detail, I want to seriously warn you, maybe we are indeed looking way too hard into this feature, more than Obbe even did in the past. 20 years later and we're finding all kinds of oversights, bugs, oddities, like if now we know what's good and what's bad. It's like we got a doctorate in how flybys work in the game. But guess what? It doesn't really matter. Back then, the developers were struggling with the PlayStation 2 hardware limitations, and what they did to make the game run so smoothly on this platform is literally a miracle. Just remember how GTA 3 or Vice City had some periodic frame rate jitterings when there wasn't even anything heavy going around. Should I mention that these 2 games are much smaller than San Andreas? That's how good this game was optimized. But as a consequence, in our opinion, Obbe didn't have enough freedom with the flyby feature, which made it clunky and it made its checks very limited. As Obbe told us, the way this feature was developed was that, as the planes were crashing, he was trying to fix the reason why this was happening. But then the next day, a plane would crash for a different reason and he would have to go back and fix that. This is why this code has become a bit of a spaghetti plate. Despite all that effort, while also being tight on time, these accidents still occur and you just give up doing more important things and unintentionally leaving some things broken in one way or another. Sure, the feature could be better, but remember that the other developers seemed to like it the way it was, with Obbe saying that the chaos was more acceptable back then. So, it is what it is. Think of it as a clunky thing that makes the game unique. There's a boogeyman that people tell stories about. I personally freaking love this feature just for that. So as a special tribute for making this boogeyman, we decided to name these planes Obbe's planes in our debug tools and footage. Bear in mind, we are not here to critique. We are here to investigate and explain to you why this feature is so unstable, even in a goofy way. So without any further ado, it's time to address the elephant in the room. The most common issue of why these planes crash all around the state is because the checks written for this feature simply ignore the existence of the wingspan, treating the plane more like a dot with no dimensions. That is to say, the spawning algorithm has no issue with putting a plane just a little off to the side from an obstacle and not completely out of the way. This will obviously end with the plane's wing colliding with something seconds after appearing in the world. What happens more frequently is that the AI doesn't see such obstacles while piloting a plane. If the collision checks don't see them coming either, then how's the plane supposed to avoid that? That's right, it can't, so it's screwed. This is when you realize that every single tall object that the map designers put around the state is essentially a threat to these planes, and it overlaps with another issue. Since Obbe's planes usually collide with a wing, they don't immediately explode on impact. Instead, they deviate from their course while losing altitude, and then they explode somewhere on the ground. It's always hard to guess where a plane is going to crash land and where it's going to explode. This is what makes these accidents so sudden and unpredictable. And you might have a question. Why didn't Obbe write some code to check the whole plane for a collision? Well, that would consume a lot more memory, and I doubt you would be happy to experience frame drops while the plane is scanning its surroundings. But let's pretend that there's no problem with the checks ignoring the wingspan. Would the plane still be prone to crashing? Sadly, yes. You see, we can't escape the fact that the plane AI is just too clunky and limited by nature to fully navigate the aircraft. If we look more closely at the collision check again, you'll immediately notice a lot of dead zones. I mean, just look at how huge these gaps are between the lines. Not to mention the AI shoots the beam from a distance and not directly from the nose of the aircraft. Even worse is if there's something with a unique form. Despite the fact that there's this tall pylon in the way, the line went right through it and it hits the small road sign behind it, which turned out to be the highest penetration point across all lines of the beam. It kind of depends on sheer luck with how precisely these lines are going to penetrate the obstacle. On top of that, don't forget that the collision check occurs every other second, which in a scale of the game is a 1000 millisecond delay. In order for you to understand how significant that is, the game puts a sphere where it occurred. And what do we have in the end? The slower a plane is, the shorter the distance between checks is, meaning the more precise its flight course is. That's another red flag for you. Here's a great example to prove this. The Rustler is the fastest plane in this pool, and it fails miserably in completing this naturally generated flyby by constantly colliding with the single building in its path, located far away from the spawn point, and it happens every single time I repeat the flyby. So let's change its model to the Beagle, and what do we see? The problem went away. The plane now simply flies over the building with some rare instances of rerouting. In other words, it became successful. So now we know that there's a chance for a randomly generated flyby to be doomed simply because the collision checks can't keep up with the plane's speed to plan an efficient route for it. And the slower the plane under the AI's control is, the more chances there are for it to survive during the flyby. That's another game of chance in my opinion. Need more proof? Let's greatly reduce the collision check delay and what do we see? Even the Rustler now successfully completes the flyby. Do you know what's even worse about this delay? It also sets the time for how long the plane flies blindly after materializing from the spawn point. Let me explain that a little better. The plane spawning is tied to the global timer, while the collision check is not. That means that the plane appears for the most time in the world before the first collision check, meaning that there's a brief moment of it not knowing what's up ahead. This brief moment can last from 0 up to 1000 milliseconds. And by repeating the same flyby over and over again, you can see it in action. Every single time, the first collision check occurs in a different place, which then affects the plane's flight path. Call it the butterfly effect if you like. This is why there are some rare instances of the Beagle rerouting instead of flying over that building, but that's not the point right now. The point is, since the AI can't pilot the plane without the collision check data, during this brief moment, the game uses randomly generated data it just got from the spawning algorithm, and this data makes all the planes fly blind differently. This is where the more devastating problems arise. The Rustler always spawns in the world generating a nose-down pitching movement until the first collision check generates some lift. As a result, this specific aircraft always tends to descend way below its spawn point, which is obviously a very dangerous maneuver. The Beagle acts slightly better in this regard. Sometimes it immediately climbs up, sometimes it stays around the same level, and sometimes it descends and then climbs. Generally speaking, that isn't great either, but at least it's not as bad as the Rustler. The Crop Duster seems to be the finest plane in the pool, as it always goes up and never descends. With all of that in mind, we have this. If the Rustler happens to spawn above an obstacle on its route, then there's a bigger chance for it to crash by blindly diving down. Yet another reason why this specific plane is more prone to crashing than any other plane in the pool. The Beagle in the same situation would be more questionable. It can either blindly crash or blindly fly over. It all depends on sheer luck and randomness. The crop duster will have an almost zero chance of crashing under such conditions. No matter how many times we repeat the flyby, all crop dusters fly over this bridge and disappear in the distance. You might be wondering, why don't the collision check and plane spawning happen simultaneously? Wouldn't that solve the problem? Well, I'm glad you hypothetically asked that because yes, it would solve the problem and we tested it. But the truth is, this is an optimization to distribute the load over time. In theory, if some planes did the collision check simultaneously, the frame rate would jitter, and Obbe clearly didn't want that to happen. This is what makes the mission air raid run smoothly. You don't see it, but the RC Barons use the same AI that we're talking about here, with every single plane doing the collision check in a different time period, and there are no frame drops. Sadly, as you can see, this optimization introduced two problems. First, being a possibility for the Beagle and Rustler to dive and crash moments after being spawned into the world. Second being, the further the plane spawns in the world from the first collision check, the longer it flies without having a clear direction of the path ahead. In the worst case scenario, it can last for 1 second straight, and that's a waste of precious time in correcting its route. We're 99% sure that it wasn't that obvious when Obbe was coding it, but yeah, this is yet another reason why planes are crashing all around the state. Since we now know about how a plane acts after being spawned into the world, you might start wondering what would be the point of using this line, which sometimes generates under a steep angle and sets the direction for a plane, to also check a flight path that a plane never flies on. I honestly don't know, but what we do know is that it is yet another reason why these planes crash from time to time. Once in a while, they naturally spawn in front of an obstacle that no plane can ever avoid, and we only have you to blame for that. No, seriously, the whole thing is coded in a way that you can manipulate the line's angle. That is to say, if you happen to look down, the line will also be shot out at a downward angle. And vice versa, by looking up, the line will also be angled upwards. Since no plane in this game flies like that, it makes this check fundamentally broken, and Obbe confirmed that. It technically works only if the player is looking straight ahead during the spawn point generation. This is when the line that checks the path will at least be parallel with the ground, which in some sense replicates the plane's flight path. And that's a huge problem if you think about it. We all periodically look up and down in this game, meaning that these actions would sometimes lead to a plane appearing in front of the obstacle. And yet again, there's nothing we can do about that. We can't just stare straight forward the entire time. Sadly, we all make mistakes, and this seems to be a very unfortunate one. Another reason why planes crash in the wild is because the AI sometimes makes bad decisions in the procedure where it changes direction, which results in leading an aircraft directly into an obstacle instead of avoiding it. One of the reasons for that is yet another unfortunate mistake. To remind you, the collision check approves the first beam in the order, whose first line reports that it's safe to fly in its direction. But at the same time, we said that there's an exception to this formula, and the exception is rather odd. You see, the highest penetration point across the rest of the 5 lines in the beam must not exceed 150 meters above the water level. If it's more, then the beam gets rejected and it shoots the next one in the order. That's basically a false direct hit report from the beam to the collision check. In such cases, the AI mostly approves the first beam in the order, which has 0 collisions. This causes a lot of issues. If you fly around the map having some sort of indication as to where these 150 meters are, you'd be surprised to see that almost all terrain around the map is actually below this threshold. This is where the plane changes its direction when the first line of the beam detects a hit. The areas which are located higher than this threshold makes the plane go into a rerouting procedure if any line in the beam hits these areas. If the small hills around the state don't cause so many issues, the real nightmare begins above this height in Mount Chiliad. But before explaining why, we need to introduce to you the unique dead-end procedure that the plane performs when every single beam reports to the collision check that its direction is doomed. In this unique scenario, the AI makes a decision to turn the plane around 180 degrees and climb to a height of 500 meters above sea level, until it gets a report from a collision check that the path in any direction is clear again. Combine that with the beams reporting false direct hits above 150 meters, and you'll understand why the planes crash so much around Mount Chiliad. It happens quite a lot around its summit. Just take a look at this. Random flybys are being generated, and most of them are doomed because the AI starts turning these planes around, and unfortunately it does it blindly without taking any obstacles into consideration. So now we know that if an aircraft ends up at a dead end, there's no friggin' way for it to safely fly away from it. Funny thing is, it doesn't even look close to being a dead end. This is just a dumb maneuver to perform here. You can find similarly dangerous places all around the mountain, even on the side of it. Fortunately, here it all depends on luck for whether or not the plane will turn around in the end. It's no wonder why the myth hunters obviously loved Mount Chiliad and its surroundings. It's so easy to spot Obbe's planes going nuts here. Good for content, but very unexpected for the typical player to be humiliated like that. Just look at what happened to a Twitch streamer named Craig. It ruined his tow truck train challenge, going with all these tow trucks up and down the mountain at least 3 times. But instead of spitting venom at the game and swearing at Obbe's planes, every single time it happened, he just laughed. See, this is what makes this feature so special. Would you attempt to complete this challenge too? Anyway, let's not forget that the aircraft is also supposed to climb to an altitude of 500 meters while doing a 180-degree turn. Funny thing about that is, Mount Chiliad's peak is roughly 527 meters. So you probably know what that means. Instead of flying away from the peak, Obbe's plane descends into the ground and, if it isn't lucky, crashes. Solely because the peak is higher than the hard-coded altitude for this procedure, and it does that blindly. Yet again, it would be a better idea for the plane to just fly over. But what can we do? To be honest, we have no idea why this hard-coded 150-meter height rejecting the beams even exists. Neither does Obbe. He said that it sounds like a leftover from an experiment, which he doesn't remember anything about anymore. By increasing this hard-coded value, we only saw improvements in the plane's navigation. That is to say, previously shown problematic flybys became less risky simply because the aircraft doesn't change its flight direction, and it instead flies over unless the first line of the beam reports a direct hit. It also means that we can say goodbye to the dead-end procedure once and for all, as the plane doesn't blindly turn around anymore. There are simply no such conditions for it anymore. On the other hand, don't expect that it would suddenly fix everything in the navigation around the mountains. Obbe's planes still occasionally crash here, but blame the other AI imperfections for that. Some of the problems we talked about before overlap with the fact that the AI never overwrites the pre-designated flight direction that it gets from the spawning algorithm. As a result, the beams never change their directions either, and it causes a lot of wonkiness in navigating a plane. I mean, yes, the AI tries to fly away from the obstacle, but when the AI sees that the 0-degree beam reports that the path is safe, immediately makes the plane return to its pre-designated direction, sometimes by making a steep banked turn. If there's still an obstacle ahead, it'll fly away from it again. So if you're lucky enough, you might see the plane flying in circles again and again until it finally crashes due to other oddities with the AI. Thanks to that, sometimes these maneuvers look wonky. One moment the plane turns in one direction, then in another, then it switches back again. It's like the AI can't decide where to turn the plane. Speaking of which, have you seen these strange situations where a plane looks like it flies straight into a mountain? It is related. Very rarely, when a plane is heading directly into an obstacle, every single new collision check decides to switch sides on where to turn the plane until it's too late. And that's the biggest problem with the changing direction procedure. Every new collision check basically gives a new direction for the AI, and it all depends on a situation whether it continues the previous maneuver or starts a new one. It lacks consistency, but again, what can we do? You would never guess what would be another reason for Obbe's planes to crash. It's none other than the wind itself, which we tried to visualize with this red arrow, or a balloon if you wish. Let us explain. I guess you know that this game has a lot of weather presets, right? What you didn't know is that all of them have different wind strengths. For instance, extra sunny weather has no wind at all. Sunny weather has mild wind. Cloudy weather has strong wind. Rainy weather has stronger wind, and its strength affects the plane's flying characteristics. When the wind blows in the same direction that the aircraft is moving in, that's called a tailwind, and it boosts the plane in a forward direction. As we previously found out, this is an issue because it makes the navigation less precise, increasing the chance for a flyby to fail. Need more proof? Let's repeat the same flyby but with no wind at all. And what do we see in the end? 0 planes are crashing into this bridge. When the wind blows against the direction in which the aircraft is moving, that's called a headwind, and it slows down a plane, decreasing chance for it to crash as it increases navigation precision. When the wind blows in a perpendicular direction that the aircraft is moving in, that's called a crosswind, which would be the worst case scenario as it blows away the plane from its trajectory. As a result, it can't fly straight and it's always trying to correct its course. Here you can perfectly see how the plane deviates from its course by having a strong wind. Yet another reason for a spawn point and navigation check to fail. As you can see, the wind constantly changes its speed, but it always blows in the same direction, just with some slight deviations. The stronger the wind is, the more it affects the plane. Speaking of which, don't forget that the plane appears around the player at random angles, meaning that the wind effects can stack up and have different strengths. Taking all of that into consideration, we have another butterfly effect, meaning not only does the flyby depend on the weather conditions, but also the plane's flying direction. To ease things up a bit, we'll mainly use extra sunny and sunny weather presets, because otherwise we would completely drown into the details. Fun fact, the wind doesn't affect mission-created aircraft as it's excluded in the code. Maybe someone decided to play it safe, which is a good thing. Moreover, the strongest wind is during the sandstorm, while there's none during foggy weather. It makes me believe that it was a case to prohibit the flyby generation during the sandstorm and allow it during the fog, but that's just me. Yet another reason why the planes are crashing in the wild is because they go into a takeoff procedure, which shoots them high into the sky. To understand the issue better, let's pretend that the AI-controlled plane is going to take off. Here's a scheme for this procedure. To put it into simple terms, as long as its wheels are touching the ground, the AI thinks that the plane is not in the air, and it checks if it's gained sufficient speed to take off. As soon as this check passes, it makes the nose pitch up and then the plane takes off. When the wheels lose contact with the ground for 4 seconds, it goes into the ordinary navigation mode and flies away. But how is a takeoff related to a flyby plane, which appears high in the sky? The thing is, there's a chance for a plane to appear above the ground with its wheels scrubbing the ground, triggering the takeoff procedure, which leads to 2 possible outcomes. If you look at the plane's spawn point, the flyby works just fine, and you might have a question then. Where's the catch? Well, if you don't look at it, then the plane flies very high into the sky, ending at a high angle of attack, increasing a chance for it to crash somewhere nearby. The reason for that is rather odd. The code responsible for the wheel collision detection is divided into 2 parts. The first one is always processed in the background, while the second one is only when the plane is on screen, causing the following issue. When you don't look at the plane, the algorithm gets stuck, and it thinks that the plane's wheels are touching the ground. Since the plane's initial speed, given by the spawn point, is always sufficient enough, the AI tilts up the plane, and it gets stuck in this loop flying very high up in the sky. 4 seconds after losing contact with the ground, it goes into the ordinary navigation mode, and then it all depends on luck if the AI can save the plane from a stall or not. Sometimes the AI saves the plane and it flies away, but either way, it's an oversight. Maybe this is what Obbe meant when he said that the planes would sometimes lose some height right after being created because their initial speed may not have generated enough lift. If only he knew about the root of the problem. We're halfway through the video, but even now you can obviously see how fundamentally broken this is. The probability for Obbe's plane to survive basically depends on a gazillion factors. If standing in one area mostly makes for risk-free flybys, then standing in a completely different area significantly increases the odds of something going wrong. If you think about that as a randomizer, then it's brilliant. So to speak, every single time the flyby occurs, Obbe's plane is there to play Russian roulette, and no one knows how many bullets are loaded, what the gun is pointed at, and if it's even loaded at all. That's basically Schrodinger's cat in the GTA universe, or Schrodinger's plane if you will. And funny enough, we only scratched the surface of this. As previously revealed by Rockstar employees, they were perfectly aware of this feature having issues. Maybe this is why they decided to implement some, let's say, silly measures to reduce these crashes. Some of them work fine, while the rest are broken, not to mention there are more undisclosed oversights and unexpected behavior, as well as fun facts that I didn't mention. But to start the topic off, have you been wondering why we haven't said a single word about the big planes having issues? You might be surprised to hear that there are no issues with them, and it's for a solid reason. No, it isn't because these planes fly very high in the sky with no obstacles around. I mean, sure, when there's nothing around, the clumsy AI has no problem avoiding obstacles, but it goes far beyond that. If you look at their spawn region again, then you'll notice that these planes are not allowed to appear when the player is lurking around any parts of Los Santos or San Fierro that have high-rises. No surprise in that at all. They fly somewhere around the height limit in these areas so that these hard-coded no-big plane zones do their job in preventing a plane from crashing into a building. But what about other high-risk areas where they are allowed to appear? Not a problem there either. The big planes are coded to appear with no collision enabled. That means that there's no way for them to crash, as they can literally fly through everything like a ghost. It's a simple and effective way to make them 100% crash-free. If we enable the collision and remove the no big plane zones and start spamming flybys for funsies, then we get to see this madness. I bet this is what Obbe had experienced in the past before he introduced this simple fix. Despite the fact that he doesn't remember it, it makes perfect sense for them to avoid such incidents at all costs, especially after what had happened a couple of years before. Now you might be wondering, why not implement something similar for the small planes too? Well, Obbe did. He introduced a special flag for map objects called Atomic Don't Collide with Flyer, assigned for example to almost all tall trees around the state. It allows an aircraft being operated by the AI to fly through an object with this flag enabled as if it was a ghost. And oh boy, it definitely saves his planes in the forested areas, because they are very, very bad at avoiding trees. The best thing about it is that you don't even see them flying through from down below. You just think that they're extremely lucky in avoiding them. If we disable this flag, then as expected, there's a near zero chance for them to survive around such areas. It's such a silly but effective way to hide AI clunkiness and minimize crashes in forested areas. On the other hand, we're not too sure if this flag was introduced for the flyby feature, because the helicopters operated by the AI have the same shtick. And the reason for that is simple. Both the plane and helicopter class share a lot of code. It means that both of these classes can also fly through various street lamps, traffic lights, and telephone poles. As you can see, all of these objects are more related to helicopters than planes. Sadly, Obbe doesn't remember anything about this flag, but it makes sense for him that he put it in. Maybe it's just a big coincidence that it helped to reduce crashes in the woods. We don't know that for sure, but nevertheless, I think we can be grateful for that. Too bad that this flag isn't assigned to the small trees either. If Carl is standing near a forested hill, then there's a chance for the plane to appear stuck in the trees. Perhaps no one at Rockstar realized that they would appear there too, but, well, clearly they do. I bet a lot of you have tried at least once to see how high you can fly with an aircraft in this game. When we tried, we noticed that the Hunter can reach an altitude of 810 meters at best, while the Hydra can hit 930 meters before the game slingshots you back down. As you can see, both have one thing in common. There's something that prevents them from going any higher. Why is that? And what's the real ceiling height limit in the game? Technically, it's 800 meters above sea level, because as soon as any aircraft exceeds this altitude, the game gradually suppresses its lift force, slowing it down. There's a reason for this. 1 kilometer above the water level is where the developers placed all kinds of interiors. This is how Rockstar made sure that no player or AI-controlled aircraft could ever reach such heights, and it works just fine. But there's a problem. Since Obbe's plane always spawns above the player no matter how high he currently is, it can easily appear to be flying way beyond that limit, and it causes an interesting issue in the flyby mechanism. If the game chooses to spawn the crop duster or the baegel, then it immediately dives straight down because the game prevents it from generating any lift. You can't see it, but the AI tries its best to recover from the dive by pulling back on the yoke. However, it can't climb because the lift force is just too minuscule. Fortunately, as soon as the plane goes below 800 meters in altitude, the limitation goes away and it can finally start generating enough lift to recover from the dive. So you probably know what that means. You have to be extremely careful during the last part of the mission's stowaway. This is where you jump out of the Andromeda from an altitude of 2 kilometers, which is way beyond that limit. Now here's the important thing. At this exact moment, the time has come to generate a random plane flying by, meaning that there's a tiny chance for one of Obbe's planes to ram the player with the propeller on its way down. That's exactly what happened to Leo Stronda, the famous Brazilian bodybuilder and gamer. While being super excited about blowing up the plane, another plane appeared out of nowhere and killed him while he was skydiving, even with full health and armor. And Leo got really mad about that. He thought he failed the mission again, which he was trying to complete several times at that point. He got so mad that he just stood up and walked off camera for 2 minutes to go cool down or something. When he got back, he continued his rant about that plane, saying the game must be messing with him and he had to replay that lousy mission again. This is how pissed he was at that poor plane trying its best to recover from a dive. 3 years later, Leo appeared in the famous Brazilian podcast Flow, where he spontaneously revealed that someone had recently shared Obbe's tweet about him creating this feature and revealing that these crashes are accidental. He then briefly described this exact bizarre encounter with the plane and why he got super mad about it, ending his story with saying that it was hilarious. We wanted to include this moment because it perfectly shows how magical this feature is if you know the truth behind this boogeyman. Now you might be wondering, what about the Rustler? Well, that nosedives too, beyond the ceiling height limit, but not as drastically as those two planes, so it isn't really an issue. For the record, it actually depends on the handling file, which defines how powerful the aircraft is, and the Rustler just generates more lift. However, it isn't that simple. If the weather is windy, then it makes the Rustler nosedive too, as it becomes less powerful in such scenarios. This is a reminder for how many things affect the flyby. Remember in the beginning of the video I said that one of the conditions to initialize the flyby is not to sit in the helicopter or plane? So guess what? This condition is essentially pointless as the game doesn't check if that's true or not until there are no aircraft loaded in the memory. And if that's true, then obviously Carl would not be sitting in one, thus passing the pointless check. It doesn't even matter what this aircraft in the memory is. It can be yours, it can be created by the scripts, or it could simply be parked somewhere nearby. Simply put, there must be none in the memory for the game to proceed further and initialize a flyby. As you can see, it makes no sense for these two conditions to coexist. My assumption is having no aircraft in the memory was probably added much later into the sequence, and as the last resort. Just think about it. Having less than 5 aircraft in the memory to even start the flyby initialization is definitely an optimization to not overload the game with a 6th plane. I guess at first, Obbe discovered that the player operating an aircraft would collide with his plane, so he prohibited the game from generating a flyby if the player was sitting in an aircraft, and this condition fixed the issue. Then it was probably discovered that his plane could collide with the other aircraft in the vicinity, so he decided to add the second, more harsh condition to fix that, but ultimately broke the logic behind the other checks. You know what's even funnier? The more harsh condition makes less sense in the final game too. You see, that special map flag we talked about some time ago is also assigned to AI-controlled aircraft, which means that Obbe's planes can't ever crash with one another. If we disable this flag and spam flybys, then you'll have a chance of them crashing into each other. Countless layers of measures. This, I guess, is a spaghetti code in all of its glory. But it was clearly a huge deal in the past, as there is yet another way to disable flybys in the game, but this time it's using a special script command which is still featured in 5 story missions. In 4 of them, it isn't a necessity as those 2 conditions prevent the flyby from occurring. Based on this fact alone, you can pretty much tell that the mission designers had some issues with Obbe's planes too. Sadly, Obbe doesn't remember that, so I won't go into the details, but you probably know what you have to do during these missions and how these planes could have screwed you over. The only mission where the script command fits organically is A Home in the Hills. This is where we have to jump out of a plane and parachute onto a helipad in the roof of Mad Dog's mansion. So can you guess what might have potentially been fixed here? If Simon Lashley, the designer of this mission, didn't restrict the flybys, then there would be a tiny chance for Obbe's plane to whack our fellow triads while they were still parachuting down onto the roof, and it looks bizarre when that happens. Or maybe there was a chance for a plane to screw up the jumping out of a plane sequence. So what can you say? The script command definitely prevents this from happening. Did you know that there's a tiny chance for Obbe's plane to knock you off in midair when you're on a jetpack? Yeah, that's right. The jetpack is not considered by the check to be an aircraft, so there's nothing stopping a flyby from happening. Fortunately, it only takes a fraction of your health, so it isn't a huge disaster. Unless you have just a little bit left. In this case, be ready to get wasted in midair from the impact. Funny thing is, most of the time you won't see a red screen right away. You lose control over Carl and see him losing consciousness on the ground. All these techniques and checks used in the spawn point generation caused 2 other goofy quirks that we can't wait to tell you about. Did you know that Obbe's planes can also materialize underwater? If there's a lot of space around you and you swim deep enough, you might spot one flying by as if it was some sort of amphibian. What's crazier about that is that it simply flies out of the water as if nothing happened. Of course, Obbe's plane isn't safe underwater either. It might still crash for a gazillion reasons. It's kind of fascinating that most people playing didn't seem to report this sight very much. You can literally find one mention from 2012 and 0 videos backing it up. Maybe players didn't go underwater too often because it quickly drains their oxygen. What's even funnier is that Obbe didn't even have any idea that his planes could appear underwater. No wonder why there's no such condition to stop it from happening. Well, lucky us to be able to spot it 20 years later, but we're definitely not the first ones to do it. Do you want to know what's even more crazy about these random spawn points? The planes can also appear in the void. Let's pretend you're just driving through the Sutherland Flint County and all of a sudden, bam, something just crashes into it, but from another side. And look at that. There's a void, so to speak. A perfect place for them to spawn. Yet again, this proves the theory that there's no way to escape from them. But enough with this madness. Now let's talk about something complex. Since the spawn point check treats the plane more like a dot, there's a chance for it to spawn half inside of an object, which typically leads to 3 different outcomes. As you would expect, sometimes the plane simply crashes afterwards as it gets pushed out, which makes it deviate from its flying course. What you don't expect it to do is to safely fly out from the object as if nothing happened. That's surprising to hear, I know. The third outcome is sometimes it just immediately despawns. Nothing to blame, it just is a safety measure that's built in the code. According to this leftover debug text, the game defines it to be stuck in the map and thus removes it from the memory. As you can see, some of the issues we were talking about happen because of how random these spawn points are. There's even a chance for it to spawn in a multi-level parking garage. So you might be wondering, why not just implement a safety feature to prevent such a goofy spawn point from being improved in the first place? Well, the truth is, such a measure does exist. It just doesn't work. But here's how it should have been. Before a plane is approved to be spawned, the final step for the algorithm is to create around the spawn point a sphere with a 15-meter radius. That's bigger than the baegel to understand its size. If the check detected something inside the sphere, then it would reject the spawn point if only there weren't 2 pesky bugs present in the code. The first bug, originally found by Nick007J, makes these scannings take place not inside the sphere, but at these 4 possible locations outside the map with just water around. So there's no surprise why this check never detects any objects inside. But fixing this bug alone also won't solve the issue. The second bug, found by Firehead, still approves the spawn point despite having objects inside the sphere. To put it very simply, whatever is found inside the sphere is marked to be already scanned before the scanning even takes place. With nothing left to scan, the check approves the spawn point. Call it a paradox if you'd like. When both of these bugs are fixed, if a spawn point generates within a radius of 15 meters from an object, it will be immediately rejected as originally intended. Not only does it make spawning half inside impossible, but it also won't trigger an aircraft going into a takeoff procedure and start flying way high up in the sky. But what's more important is that it basically gives an aircraft a little bit more free space to maneuver in the first seconds of its journey. When we asked Obbe about this check, he unfortunately didn't say much about it. I believe he simply didn't finish this check, but he was close. Either way, it's not a big loss. It wouldn't globally change much as it's just a teardrop in the ocean. Remember when I said that these conditions to initialize the flyby aren't perfect as they still might slip through due to various delays? If you look at this map again, then you'll definitely remember that the small planes are strictly prohibited from spawning in the cities. So now you might be thinking, why do they still appear beyond their spawn region? Well, there's a few reasons for that. One of them being that you just happen to exit the right interior at the right time. Let me explain that. As we previously found out, the flyby is not going to happen when CJ is indoors. I mean, you can be in the interior for as long as you want and no planes will ever spawn around. But keep in mind that the flyby timer is still ticking here. That wouldn't be a big issue as long as it didn't switch a variable from indoors to outdoors by stepping on the yellow arrow to exit. If that was the last condition to initialize the flyby, then it would start generating a plane, but with the area checks passed, throwing a plane in the city. And that is probably the worst place for it to appear. There are way too many tall structures around. This is why most of these accidents happen near enterable buildings on other people's footage, and now you know why. But there is a catch. The interior must also be located in the small plane spawn region. If not, then the big plane appears. It's as simple as that. Funny thing is, the planes can also spawn while you're still going through the door. So if you're extremely lucky, like Joshima's on this footage during the mission The Meat Business, you'll encounter the rustler falling from the sky like a meteor or something and exploding into pieces. This time the explanation is kind of bizarre. The abattoir is one of those interiors which is placed directly above its exterior very high in the sky, with the limitation taking place to suppress aircraft lift force. Since the shootout in the abattoir is long enough, it will always be about time to generate a flyby. If Obbe's plane crashes directly into the interior with enough force to disable its AI, it will freefall vertically. So if all the stars are perfectly aligned, when you step outside, you will see it falling somewhere nearby and crash from the impact with the ground. We're not gonna lie to you, we couldn't naturally produce it without using the debug tools we made. It seems that you just have to be very lucky to trigger this one. First, you have to be lucky for the game to generate a flyby fast enough before the screen fades out, which is a rare sight as the planes mostly spawn when you get outside. Second, it has to crash into the interior in a very specific way while you're still indoors, and it has to be exactly the rustler. The other two planes, judging from the tests, will always nose down into the void and in this case not even get a scratch from the interior. Despite the fact that there are many subtleties, it seems that it does happen in the game. Funny enough, you can increase the odds by unintentionally entering the building when the plane generation status is set to the pending state. Thanks to the condition, the flyby generation will be frozen. So as soon as you step into the annex, the game will generate the plane right away. Another way to make the small planes appear in the city is by sometimes watching a cinematic cutscene which takes place indoors. Basically, it's the same thing as before. While the planes are prohibited from spawning when the player is watching a cutscene, as soon as it ends and if the time has come, a small plane might slip through and spawn in a place where it doesn't belong. And you know what's funny? Apparently, Rockstar was perfectly aware of both of these issues. This is why someone at the company programmed this timer to infinitely reset while the player is either indoors or watching a cutscene. The only problem is it doesn't work because the trigger was accidentally put beyond the sequence. Interestingly enough, the same fate befell the train removal procedure. To make a long story short, the train is set to get removed from the memory as soon as it moves away by 220 meters from the camera, and it does work perfectly, but what doesn't work are these three additional conditions to remove it. 1, if you're watching a cutscene. 2, if the outdoors suddenly become indoors. Or 3, if we're currently in a gang war. In any of these cases, if the train is loaded into the memory, it will be traveling around the map indefinitely when the intention was to remove it. Both plane and train triggers literally go one after another, and at the same time they're not related to each other. This is why we think that someone could have just framed Obbe by putting them both in the wrong place, but who knows. When the code is moved to the right place, the timer will infinitely reset while watching a cutscene and while being indoors, making it impossible for the flyby to go into the initialization state as soon as these actions end. Also, you won't be able to freeze this state by entering the building at the right time anymore. In my opinion, this measure greatly reduces small plane spawnings in the cities and in the interior universe as well. Too bad that it's broken. And you might be wondering, why just reduce? Well, this is because there's yet another way to do it. It might happen after you load a save game, made by picking up the floppy disk in front of the Four Dragons Casino or the Doherty Garage in San Fierro, but only if you are very, very lucky. As soon as you load one of your saves, there's a very brief moment when the game thinks that you're located in the weather region default, in the region where the small planes are allowed to spawn. The only question is, what would happen first, the flyby initialization or the weather region update with restricted zones? If the values you happen to save when your game refreshes the weather region after the game initializes the flyby, then you'll see a small plane flying by every time you load this specific save. But if it's before, then it will always be the big plane. Fortunately for you, this scenario happens more often as the game updates the weather region more frequently. The least dangerous place for the small plane to appear is the garage in Doherty. You just have to pray for the aircraft to not bump into this construction crane. Other than that, the surroundings do not pose a threat, unless we miss something out here. The Four Dragons Casino is probably the worst place for it to happen. there's a massive sign for the come-a-lot around, which happens to be in the plane's path sometimes. Since the medium-tall palm trees around don't have that special flag enabled, they usually end up crashing into them and exploding into pieces. And don't forget about the possibility for them to crash directly into the casino building itself. And oh boy, you have to be praying for the plane to not deviate from its course and explode countless times just 3 inches from CJ. Sometimes these collisions happen off-screen, and you end up hearing multiple explosions somewhere close, which is definitely going to freak you out or at least raise some suspicion. The real fun begins if you use something like a mod or a script to save anywhere you want. If you do that, then be prepared to witness this at different locations too. If you wonder why a flyby occurs immediately after you load a save, it's because the game never saves the last time it generated a flyby. So if you played more than enough in that save, then the game will always look at the global timer and see that it's just about time to create one. Fortunately, if something goes sideways, then you can at least reload the save and retry your luck. Or better yet, resave your progress if you want these little planes to go away until the next time. And you know what? I think it's hard to even call this one a bug. I mean, it's a byproduct of dozens of delays, variables, and their values, which is very hard to debug and predict. I once greatly reduced the flyby timer and clicked through the pilot school menus, noticing that the flyby occurs during the fadeouts. It means if you click through the menus fast enough, then you might end up in a situation like Joshima's, colliding with Obbe's plane seconds after starting a lesson.
What the f?
Sometimes you have to just be extremely lucky to trigger such bugs. The same thing can be said about another way to make the small plane appear in the city. All you have to do is get wasted or busted slightly before the game starts generating a plane in the area, where the small planes are allowed to spawn. Once again, it skips all area checks and makes the small plane appear near a hospital or police precinct with a chance for its flyby to fail. Maybe you just never experienced it, but it definitely happens. It proves our point. You just have to be lucky in one way or another. Of course, there are more ways for the planes to appear where they aren't supposed to be, but they're too rare and too minor to talk about, so we'll just leave that here. And now it's about time to finally talk about the 3 hard-coded and internally called no-plane zones, which for the most part reduce the small plane spawn region. Interestingly enough, all 3 of them are located in San Fierro. The first no-plane zone is the Gant Bridge, connecting San Fierro with Tierra Robata. Judging from its size, it was clearly made to protect the player while they're crossing the bridge. And that was done for a good reason, because if you remove the zone, get ready for one of Obbe's planes to hit a pillar and play Russian roulette with you. Maybe this is what the testers were dealing with back in the day, and I'm very thankful that it was such a simple fix. The second no-plane zone mainly covers the Garver Bridge, and once again it was probably a challenge to cross it in one piece. Since this bridge is placed diagonally in the game, the restricted area is quite large, meaning that you're also covered while boating nearby. But wait a minute, why have we just excluded the Kincaid Bridge out of the equation while being covered too? Well, this is because this zone clearly starts and ends where the Garver Bridge's cables rise. It makes perfect sense why this zone doesn't fully cover the other side of the rail bridge in Tierra Robata. As expected, there's a chance for the plane to naturally spawn and crash into it. This zone clearly had to be bigger if they really wanted to fully cover this bridge too. The third and final no-plane zone is Easter Bay Chemicals, having 6 tall smokestacks which would obviously cause some problems. Yes, we had to test it, and what would it be like if no such zone ever existed? What makes these zones more special is that they intentionally infinitely reset the flyby respawn timer, and it actually works out of the box. So once you leave these areas, you'll have to wait some time for the game to initialize the next one. Funny enough, out of all the tall objects around the map, it was decided to protect the player from unforeseen consequences exactly at these 3 places only. I mean, there's the Big Ear in Bone County, and the tall radio antenna next to the Big Ear, radio tower in Missionary Hill, large oil refinery called Green Palms, and many other similar places that act like a beacon. Maybe the developers, and perhaps Obbe in particular, didn't have enough time to make more zones, but who knows. Another silly way to reduce unforeseen accidents was to add 20 extra meters to the plane's safe altitude in the last step before spawning it, which is a very strange decision that we should explain. Moments after the plane appears in the world, you'll always see it generating lift. This increase in altitude happens as a result of the AI reaching a safe altitude, which is always 20 meters above its naturally generated spawn point. If we change it to add 0 meters instead, then the plane won't do this anymore, so it's safe to say that it was implemented intentionally. Unfortunately, it doesn't really seem to help, as the Beagle and Rustler tend to descend after spawning into the world. This is when the risk of crashing is higher, not after they've already gained altitude. As obvious as it may sound, from a technical standpoint, the flyby feature is a complete disaster made out of spaghetti code. Perhaps this is the most broken thing in the entire game, and I bet Obbe didn't even realize how buggy and unstable this is. On the other hand, if you look at it from an entertainment perspective, Obbe did manage to create a unique experience too, a special sauce if you would like. This is why we are happy to present to you goofy tips and tricks to lower your chances of being humiliated by these crazy planes, which might be useful for speedrunners as well.
There's such a... Hello?
If you see a newly created plane that's about to crash, just look down as fast as you can and it will vanish like it was a bad dream. Kudos for that tip goes to Obbe himself and his built-in safety measure, which unloads all traffic beyond 70 meters from Carl from the memory. Since the small planes spawn at a distance of 140 meters, you have a good chance of making them disappear unless the plane is already too close. As goofy as it sounds, if you don't want unexpected surprises after exiting interiors, just immediately look down after appearing outside. Yeah, that's kinda silly, but can you name a better way to safely exit from the building in this game? Here's another one. Remember how one strange condition to initialize the flyby is to not have an aircraft loaded in the memory? Funny thing is, you can exploit that to your advantage and disable these flybys for the duration of the game session by simply making any aircraft despawn-proof. The speedrunners call it marking vehicles, which is done by duping missions with a big cleanup list. Long story short, some missions mark your vehicle as mission vehicle to prohibit the game from unloading it from the memory until you end the mission. This is when it becomes normal again, as it quietly removes the flag. When you dupe a mission with a big cleanup list, the list ends up being so big in the end that such a vehicle will be excluded from the cleanup process, and it will remain as a mission vehicle, and that can apply to aircraft too. So if you do it correctly, you'll get a despawn-proof aircraft, and since it will always stay in the memory, the flyby won't ever go into the initialization state because of that strange condition. Unfortunately, these were all our tips and tricks that we had prepared for you. Other than that, you're on your own. But the question remains, was it possible for Rockstar and Obbe in particular to bring order into the chaos by somehow fixing these flybys once and for all? Well, in our opinion, not really. Because the real solution would be to fully rewrite the plane AI. In its current form, it's very limited, basic, and definitely slow. It's just not capable of being able to navigate at such a low altitude in a dynamic environment. It's only good at flying very high in the sky with no obstacles around, and that's the cold, hard truth. We have a strong feeling that the aircraft AI was never really finished either, because according to the leaked mission sources, Rockstar planned to feature real competitors in every single air race, but they disabled them in the code, and they did that for a reason. This is when you realize how broken their behavior is. The AI can't even properly fly through the checkpoints, and that's a very simple task if you think about it. Most of the time, the aircraft deviates from its course. Sometimes the plane ends up flying in circles until it finally hits the checkpoint, and this just goes on and on. I think my favorite race is definitely the military service one, where the opponents are just going to crash their hydras after taking off. The evidence is crystal clear. The code wasn't ready for the races, so Rockstar cut the opponents. Maybe it wasn't ready for the flyby either, but either way, bear in mind that rewriting the AI wouldn't be enough. Something also had to be done with the spawning algorithm. A lot of the crashes we saw could have been easily avoided if the game didn't generate spawn points unfairly, such as in cities and very close to tall objects. The checks definitely should be more flexible to find a less complex route for a plane to fly. So what do we have in the end? To fully fix the issues, Rockstar had to rewrite the whole feature. And let's be honest, it wasn't really worth rewriting anything. That would be way too tedious. Definitely more memory consuming, and for what? Just to fix one clumsy feature? As Obbe mentioned numerous times before, they were always low on memory, so I think we can understand why he considered removing it and calling it a day. Now here's where things get really interesting. Judging from the leaked GTA 5 source code, at some point during the development, it used the Payne AI from San Andreas. The only difference is someone at Rockstar decreased 3 different values in the code, and it definitely wasn't Obbe because he left the company shortly after GTA 4 came out. Other than that, the AI is absolutely the same, just unused. And by porting these values back into San Andreas, we get some very interesting results. Instead of shooting the beam from a distance, it now shoots from the plane's center point. The distance was called prediction time for mountain avoidance by Obbe. The second variable that someone changed is look ahead in time, and that's a very important one. As Obbe had mentioned to us, it was tricky for him to get the flight stability right, adding that planes tended to oscillate too much until he made the steering corrections based on where they were predicted to be and not based on their current location. And this is exactly what we see with decreased value eliminating the fix. The plane oscillates. It constantly ascends and descends, flying in a wave or something like that. It's not a very good change at all. The last value that someone played with is also important. Sadly, we don't know its original name, but it defines how responsive the AI is. That is to say, by decreasing this value, you make it more sluggish. And just look at this mess. The planes do everything so slowly now that you might be wondering if the AI is even trying to navigate the plane. Usually you'll see them crashing directly into an obstacle simply because the AI became too slow to avoid it. Maybe someone at Rockstar was testing the AI to see if they could reuse it for GTA 5, but clearly they made it worse. You kinda get the feeling that they just changed the values to see what they would do. Either way, as far as we and other data miners can see, it was later ditched in favor of a new and more upgraded AI that they wrote. But the question remains, was there an easier way to improve the situation with the crashes without rewriting the AI? Well, yes. The collision checks should have been more frequent as we showed you once before. It will definitely fix those situations where a plane doesn't have enough time to climb or reroute simply because of how slow these checks are. However, if the plane can't technically avoid an obstacle, then it ends up in the same situation as before. Point is, it definitely does improve things, but it's clearly still not enough. Fun fact, according to the note found in the GTA 5 sources, presumably left by Obbe, originally the collision check occurred every other 2 seconds instead of 1, and holy smokes, it makes it even worse. I guess we can be glad that they made it 1 second after all. You might be wondering, why exactly 1 second? Well, we removed it in the PS2 version, allowed the game to spawn Obbe's plane as soon as it got despawned, and made an FPS counter and asked people to test the performance on their real hardware. When there's a lot of stuff going around, the flyby starts to cause slight FPS jittering, which clearly was an unacceptable sacrifice in comparison with the dumber AI back in the day. Honestly, we thought it was going to be much worse, so 1 second was a happy medium, I bet. But then we went even further by allowing the game to spawn 5 of Obbe's planes at once. And you know what? The game didn't become a slideshow. Yeah, there were some frame rate jitters, but it was still playable. It really shows how well this game was optimized on PS2. Special thanks to these people for wasting their time filming this footage for us to figure that out. If Obbe didn't want to make the collision check even more frequent, then why not generate spawn points much higher in the sky where there's less objects around? Well, the answer is simple. When Cupatom theorized this exact solution, Obbe replied to him on Twitter that we wouldn't see them as much, and he clearly has a point. Maybe this is why these planes were coded to spawn and fly not that far from the ground. Clearly, the intention was for the player to always see them flying by, and when everything works as intended, it does look fantastic. But if Obbe didn't want to change the height, then why not make these flybys predefined as Rockstar later did in GTA 5? Sure, they would probably always be accident-free, but you need to make a ton to compete with the random ones. Also, there's no guarantee that the player will actually see them in their line of sight, not to mention they would repeat over and over again. So if that wasn't an option either, then why not make more restricted areas for planes? Honestly, that would really be a nice addition. The only bad thing about it is they would probably have to make a lot, and they might still miss a ton of risky areas. Another solution would be to assign that special flag to other objects, so that they wouldn't collide with them and crash. Maybe it does look cheap, but hey, at least it works. There could also be more conditions that stop a flyby from generating. You can go on and on with solutions, but that isn't the point. The point is, it definitely was possible to improve the situation. Maybe the developers, and Obbe in particular, just didn't have enough time left to spend on adding more patches or experimenting with ideas. And we're not gonna lie to you, it took us about 3 or 4 months to figure out everything about this feature. In some ways, it is too crazy. So maybe one day Obbe said screw it and just left it as is, doing some more important things rather than figuring out why these stupid planes are crashing over and over again. As Craig Filshie once said, they loved these random accidents, so the feature stayed and the boogeyman was born. And here's something else too. During one of the closed presentations held by Rockstar previewing the game to journalists, a plane crash occurred. And you know what? Instead of yapping about the bug, OPSM2 Netherlands journalists were so inspired by this that they wrote about this incident in the Cool Things to Do in San Andreas section, writing that it would be a great hobby for a player to do, to steal a plane and crash it on purpose. It's a very odd thing to write about. We don't know about it for sure, but maybe they talked about that during the presentation too. Either way, maybe there's another reason why the feature stayed in the game, because the journalists loved it too. As Obbe later mentioned, it was fun to integrate the flyby feature, adding that the chaos was more acceptable back then. He's got a point when he says that games are more serious nowadays. And that wraps up the story of these famous planes, a boogeyman of this game that we love and hate. For more videos on GTA, Rockstar games, and some other stuff occasionally, don't forget to check out my channel, BadgerGoodger, right here on YouTube. And myself and Vadim are both on Twitter, or X as it's known as now, so go ahead and give us a follow there if you're still there and you haven't gone to Blue Sky yet. This has been Badger, and I hope you have a great rest of your day out there.